Good day to you. You know, today is a big day for movies here in Stroudsburg because the Cinemark movie theater complex is opening back up after the pandemic restrictions out here at the Stroud Mall. And that's going to be welcome news for a lot of people who really enjoy movies, not necessarily for the movies themselves. They enjoy going because they're trying to stimulate a romance, they're taking somebody out on a date. They're going because they want to escape from the pandemic and all the horrors of living inside in an isolated existence. They're going to the movie theater to cool down in the summer. They're going to the movie theater to be immersed in a big screen and see people who are larger than life. So there's a lot of reasons that people go to movies, and that's how I'm starting today's class. We're talking about movies. We're taking on chapter 8, and just think about that word, movie. You say it all the time, but do you really think of where it comes from? It's about something that moves. It's about a video image that moves. That's where movie comes from. So let's take on this next technology, an intro to mass media, and trace its developments and see where society has changed because of this new mass communication technology, the movie. So we'll say that movies got their roots in the 1800s, and once again, please note how quickly mass media technologies are accelerating now, right? Once again, remember that we studied the oral language as being 40,000 years old, and then it wasn't until 3,500 BC, almost 35,000 years later, that we get the written language. That's a long time to develop a new technology of communication, but now it's happening so rapidly, right? Radio, movies, and be going into television. Next to the 1880s, the movies get their early starts, and we're going to trace that development by talking about our first movie makers. And the first movie maker we want to mention is Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison, again, we're highlighting this inventor here across different inventions. The last inventions that he had a hand in were audio inventions, and now we're talking about Thomas Edison. But before we get to Thomas Edison, let's mention a Frenchman. The Frenchman is Etienne, Etienne, Etienne Jules Marey. Etienne dash Jules. He had a hyphenated first name, Marey, Marey. And he developed this idea that maybe many of you played around with in a kindergarten or first grade class. You know how you can draw figures on a flip book and then flip the pages and the figures appear to be moving? And that's basically what Etienne Jules Marey did. He developed a system for taking not pictures, but photographs. Not drawing pictures, but taking photographs. He would take photographs and then he would juxtapose them and flip them one after another. And this is the very first form of early movie making. You can see some links for Etienne Jules Marey in the email that I've sent out today. He invented a device that he called a zoetrope. A zoetrope, Zoetrope. And this had images on a moving cylinder, and you looked into this box where the cylinder was, and you could see moving images. And the very first film that, if you want to call it a film that he became famous for, was the governor of California wanted to settle a bet whether a horse, when it was galloping, whether there was any point during that gallop where all four horse hooves were not on the ground, or the opposite, whether there was always a horse's hoof on the ground. And so he commissioned Edward Muybridge. Edward Muybridge, another inventor here, Muybridge. Sorry, I have to step back. I misspoke. Etienne Jules Marey did not develop the zoetrope. That was developed by Edward Muybridge, and he has a very strange spelling of his name. It's Eadweard. That's Edward Muybridge. And he was the one who developed the zoetrope to show a horse galloping across. And in fact, you can see for yourself. I'm going to leave that mystery to you in the link today, whether a horse's hoof all four hooves leave the ground at one time. Okay, so piggybacking on top of Edward Muybridge's zoetrope, the next invention that we have is by Thomas Edison, actually his company. Thomas Edison invented the kinetoscope. The kinetoscope, that's Kinetoscope. And a kinetoscope was, I guess you could think of it as a kind of a Nickelodeon, if you know what that is. It's a box, right? And you put a nickel in it, and you have a viewfinder, and you get to watch what's inside. It's a single viewing experience. Your eyes are blocked out. It's like going into a photo booth in the mall in some ways. In Edison's invention, the kinetoscope, he was showing a man showing his muscles. There was a muscle going back and forth like that. And he also showed Annie Oakley riding a horse. These were the very first images. And can you just imagine for the first time seeing moving visual images, especially human beings? This was a massive breakthrough. Before that, we had just had a breakthrough of audio technology breaking through the barrier of space to communicate. That in itself was groundbreaking. And now all of a sudden we are able to see people in motion. And that's the first time that that's ever happened because of all these inventors. So because of Edison's kinetoscope, we have Nickelodeons, places where you can go watch movies. Again, it's a private experience. You're burying your face into a viewfinder. You're putting a nickel in. I'd like to mention next two French brothers. A lot of French development of the technology of film here. The brothers' names were Lumiere, Lumiere. You might recognize that name today. It speaks to the brightness of a light bulb. When you go to buy a light bulb in the store, how many Lumieres does it have? It comes from these person's last name. And they took the idea of the Nickelodeon, of the kinetoscope, and they came up with their own invention. It was a cinematograph, not quite sure how to pronounce it there. And it's the idea of projecting film onto a screen. So they broke outside of the private, personal viewing experience of film, and they made it now possible to be a public event because more than one person could watch a projected image on a screen. So that pretty much opens up the film industry in its modern day form, so to speak. And the very first filmmaker we want to talk about now is Edwin Porter. Edwin Porter was the very first person not to use film to tell real-life events like a man flexing his muscles or a horse galloping, but he created a film that was the very first story. It was a narrative. It was a fiction. And his film was called The Great Train Robbery. You can watch it at the link that I've included today. It's got outlaws. It's got passengers who were attacked on the train. It's got gunfire. It's got drama. And it proves really that filmmaking from its very early inception was violent. Filmmaking was violent, as was embodied in The Great Train Robbery. Next up is the filmmaker D.W. He has two initials for his first name, D.W. Griffith. D.W. Griffith, and he's the first person to have what we today call a blockbuster. A blockbuster is an epic film that captures the nation's imagination. It's an epic film that captures the nation's imagination. D.W. Griffith had the very first film. I'm going to tell you about it in a minute. He also was the first one to shoot films that were an hour long or more. So he basically set up the format for the film. The average film is usually around 2 hours, can be a little less, an hour and a half, can be 2.5 hours. That's sort of where film has settled in with its time chunk that it takes to take it in. So his film, anyway, D.W. Griffith, was Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation. It's a film by today's standards that a lot of people are trying to examine to determine whether it was racist. Whether it was racist or was it simply depicting the times as they were in 1915, which is when he released this film. And so what the film is about, it's a film that portrays the North and the South in the Civil War, and it portrays the aftermath of the war as well. And in the film, black people are portrayed as beasts, as primitive beasts, and attacking the North. You can watch clips from that film itself. You can watch the whole entire film if you like. It's in the link that I've sent to you. And so the debate rages today, was he simply just acting as a journalist and recording the way that people were actually behaving, documenting them, so to speak, or was he racist? That's a decision that you'll have to make for yourself. Because of D.W. Griffith, we get, quote unquote, the movie star situation or the movie star system. Movie stars. You see, prior to D.W. Griffith, actors did not get credit from the movie studios. The movie studios owned the actors. They told them where they had to be and at what time. They told them what films they had to act in. They even controlled things like their diet and their appearances. And that was because the film studios did not want actors asking for more money. But D.W. Griffith said, no, I'm not going to do that. So he hired the first movie star, the very first movie star, Florence Griffith. Florence Griffith, and he paid her big money, and he thereby set up this whole system of stars where if you want to be a successful film, the best chance is if you have a star in the film, like a Bradley Cooper, for example, is gonna help your film, or a Morgan Freeman is gonna help your film, or a J-Lo is gonna help your film. So the star system, where people idolize these movie stars, where they follow their lives in the tabloids and they're interested in who they're marrying and what dresses they're wearing on the red carpet, etc., that all begins with D.W. Griffith. All right, now let's talk about the studio system. I've mentioned it briefly already. The studio system was in place. Thomas Edison was making his films with his big studio company just outside of New York City. New Jersey was the filmmaking place, and the studio system was in place in New Jersey. And the studio system was where the talent worked directly for the movie studios. They didn't have agents. So talent worked for Paramount or MGM or Warner Brothers. And movies were put together in an assembly line fashion. If you look at the National Edison Park that I have a link for online, and even if you go there to visit, you'll see like a factory set up with different studio spaces right next to each other where you could change the sets. And so movies were put together much like anything else was put together in industrialization, in a kind of a factory process. Very little creative control. And the writers and the actors and the directors, they all worked for a weekly salary. They weren't paid based on commission of the film. They were paid according to a weekly salary. But worst of all, the studios would require theaters to take block bookings. Block bookings. That means the studio has 10 films, and the theater has to take all 10 films if it wants to take one of the films. And you don't even get to know what all the films are. You just have to accept them. And some of them could be real duds. That was the studio system. So a group of actors and writers and producers, they were not happy with this system, and they were people like Charlie Chaplin, if you know who he is. He was an English comedian with a bowler hat. He was a silent film and mustache. My grandfather in England actually cut his hair one time. He worked briefly as a barber in London and cut Charlie Chaplin's hair. So Charlie Chaplin and Florence Griffith and others formed a group called the United Artists. And their idea was to wrestle control from the studio system. And in fact, what they did was they took their operation and they moved. And where did they move to? They moved to, you guessed it, I hope, Hollywood. Hollywood, California, perfect place for making films because it's wide open, at least it was during that time. Today, California is very crowded, but it was wide open, not that many people. Plus, you have all these different terrains for movie backdrops. You've got the mountains with snow, if you want them. You've got the beach, both within driving distance. You've got a desert. You've got suburbs. And you've got great weather all year around, for the most part. So this was the place where filmmaking settled into Hollywood. Now we're going to mention another major development in films. You might have guessed, without knowing it, that films in the early part were silent films. It's very difficult to put sound into a film. It's quite a complicated process that involves syncing up the sound with the motion in the picture. It's very difficult to do. So prior to that, films were not talking films. That changed in 1927 with a film called The Jazz Singer. The Jazz Singer, which wasn't really a talking film. It was really a film that had two talking/singing segments that were edited into it, but still it broke the mold for the next film to come along that actually did a synchronized soundtrack and a proper synchronized soundtrack and making it a talking film, and that was Don Juan. The film Don Juan, Juan, which is just a Spanish word for John, and that was the very first full-fledged talking system. So the end of the studio system comes crashing down. It's helped by two court cases as well. In 1938, the Department of Justice was concerned about the monopolies that studios had. And so what they did was they decided to break those up, and they limited block bookings. So studios could not force a theater to take 10 films. And they allowed theater owners in 1938, the Department of Justice, to see the films before they actually had to book those films. And then the icing on the cake for the end of the studio system was 1948. In 1948, the Supreme Court, highest court in the land, the Supreme Court ruled that studios have to sell their theaters. So now theaters could be independently operated and owned, just like Cinemark. Even though it's a franchise, it's operating its own decisions. All right, now let's talk about a dark period in Hollywood known as the Blacklist era. The Blacklist era. So after World War II, there was a big communism scare in this country where people were afraid of people who might be communist sympathizers because the United States was in a, quote, Cold War. No bullets were fired, a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And so there was a search for people who might be communist sympathizers, and 10 movie actors were identified, in part by the most vocal senator talking about communist sympathizers. His name was Joseph McCarthy, and McCarthyism, you might have heard of it. So the Hollywood 10, as they became known, these 10 people, they were actors, they were writers, they were directors. They were called before Congress to answer questions about whether they were members of the Communist Party, and they refused. And as a result, they were thrown in jail. And then blacklisted. That's where that name comes from, blacklisted. No studios, nobody would hire them. No filmmaking company would hire them. And that list actually grew to 324 people that could not find work in Hollywood simply because their reputation was that they were communist sympathizers. Now let's move to talking about television, much like we did with radio, how TV interrupts movies' big party, so to speak. So television comes along in the 1950s. It becomes very popular, and it coincides with people moving out to the suburbs. That is, we're seeing another transformation now. We saw them moving into the cities for industrialization, where you get things like the penny press and the printing press powered by steam engines, a factory setting, people living in the cities. Now, with acquiring wealth and not liking the pace of life in the city and the congestion, people start to move out to what we refer to as suburbs, suburban suburbs. That's where that word comes from. And the TV plays a very big role in the growth of suburbs because the TV facilitates an ability to stay in touch with life, with what's going on, by watching this box that you have in your room. So TV becomes very, very popular, and people start to wane in terms of their TV viewing because they're getting something similar. They're getting a small screen, but they're still getting people moving. They're still getting the idea of movies. So Hollywood had to react. It had to stop this, the direction of losing an audience. And the way that Hollywood reacted was it started to produce larger than life movies that simply would not be conveyed with much drama or interest if they were done on television because the screen is too small. So they would shoot these scenes for the movie screens with incredible expanse. And you'll see a film there that's in the email that I sent. That's the film Spartacus, starring the actor Kirk Douglas. He only died a couple months ago. He was over 100 years old, Kirk Douglas. His son is Michael Douglas. And so he was in that film Spartacus. Another film is The Ten Commandments. And just when you look at the link, just look at how expansive the set is. TV can't replicate that. Also, Hollywood turned to the use of color in films. It seems like a natural, right? But color, again, is a very complicated process to introduce into filmmaking. So it took a while, but Hollywood increased its use of color, which television could not represent at that time. It was black and white. And the first films to do that were Gone with the Wind, a film today that is racist, and also The Wizard of Oz. And then also Hollywood tried 3D films. They're still experimenting with 3D films today, but they tried it in the growth of television. Also, we have the growth of multiplex theaters to combat television being viewed in the home in the suburbs. Multiplex theaters are where you have one facility. They're showing not only many different films, but sometimes the same film in different versions. Like one might be in Spanish, one might be in English, one might be in 3D, one might not be in 3D. So we have multiplex theaters growing up as well as a result of television. Now let's talk about the blockbuster era. The blockbuster era, the very first blockbuster film was Jaws in 1975. I actually saw that film in a movie theater, and I have to say I'm blown away today that people still will not go in the water at the beach because of a fear of sharks. And that's what that film Jaws did. It was a blockbuster film. It employed a bunch of new marketing techniques. First of all, it was based on a book, Peter Benchley's book called Jaws. Second of all, it used television to promote the film. You can look at a trailer for the film in the email that I sent you if you haven't ever seen it. But it launched the blockbuster era, and that film captured everybody's imagination. To call it an epic film, it's an understatement. Everybody was talking about that film that summer that it came out. It was the first film that grossed more than $200 million. Other epic blockbuster films followed, including Star Wars, which became a whole franchise, Spider-Man, Pirates of the Caribbean, Dark Knight, Twilight, the Final Destination franchise. All of those are examples of following in the footsteps of Jaws and what it was able to achieve. Now let's talk about home video. Most homes today are outfitted with a big screen TV. Even one-room apartments often have a big screen TV. They're not anywhere as near as expensive as they used to be. And it all started, the idea of home movie viewing, with the the VCR, the video cassette recorder, VCR. Some of your grandparents or even your parents may still have one in their houses. It's tape. And what it did was it allowed a movie rental business to take foot in the form of a business called Blockbuster. Do you remember Blockbusters? You could go and rent a VHS, take it home, and then return it the next day. And then later that was replaced by DVDs. So what that did was it opened up movies to viewing in the home. Even though when VCRs were first developed in the 1980s, we didn't have the big screen TV. TVs were still square in the way that they looked at that time. But it opened up home viewing, and it also opened up the ability to record and copy and stop and play back films. So this gave audiences more control of the films. And it also opened up older movies that were not running in the theaters anymore because they ran 4 or 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 10 years ago. Now those films could be viewed on VHS. And so it opened up new audiences to older films. That's what the VHS did. Now let's talk about digital production and projection. So the average person has a movie making capability right in your hands with your cell phone, right? I'm making, in a way, a movie today, and those of you with iPhones can put all kinds of effects on your movies. So digital production starts to take a hold in 2004. In 2004, the very first film that was produced in digital was Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow. Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow. It's the first American mainstream movie in which all of the backgrounds were computer animated. They're fake. They're false. They're all generated using a computer. That film broke through. And in the same year, in the 2000, we have movie theaters converting to digital projectors as well so that they can project digital films. So now let's move to discussing what makes a film profitable. What makes a film profitable? Because actually only 20 to 30% of films make money. There's a huge cost of production. There's a cost of distribution, getting the films out to be seen. There's a cost of star salaries. And there's a cost of promotion in general, all very high. So the easiest way to make money in a film is to make a blockbuster with a big name director. A big name, Martin Scorsese, I mentioned him earlier, put his name on it. He's a big name director. Quentin Tarantino, big name director. And then also, if a film doesn't run that well in the United States, there's still the foreign box office because films are traveling all over the world, and actually Hollywood films can be seen in even the smallest villages in Africa. That's how widespread Hollywood distribution is. What about the effect of films on society? Let's talk about that now, movies and society. You know, there was a famous film with Clark Gable, an actor. Clark Gable was in a film called It Happened One Night. And in this film, he took off his shirt, and underneath his shirt was not the traditional white t-shirt that males wore at that time. He had no shirt on at all. And so there was a study done by the Pain study. There were a study done, sorry, not the Pain studies, those are different studies, but there was a study done, and it found that undershirts plummeted. The sale of undershirts plummeted after Clark Gable had that scene in the film. So films were said to have a big impact. And in fact, there were some studies that came out by the Payne Fund, Payne Fund, in the 1920s, and they found that three quarters of all movies deal with crime, sex, or love. Who would have thought, right? Those are the subjects that are most interesting to everybody. And so these studies argued that films were largely responsible for the moral decay of society because the standards of actors tend to be lower than those of the average person. And even social psychologists, famous ones, if you study psychology or sociology in a sociology class or a psychology class, you'll learn about Herbert Bloomler. And Herbert Bloomler found that young people imitate behaviors. They imitate behaviors that they see in films. They copy those behaviors. An example is The Program. Have you seen that film? It's a film in which a college quarterback performs extreme stunts, including laying on train tracks. And there was a teenager shortly after that film was released who was killed lying on train tracks by a train. So that film was cited as the kind of influence that Hollywood has. But as big as Hollywood is, it's not the biggest filmmaking industry in the world. No, it's not. It's actually Bollywood. Yeah, the tongue-in-cheek, knockoff of Hollywood. Bollywood in India. Bollywood India, they produce more than 1,000 films a year. Probably the most popular film, which you may have seen, is Slumdog Millionaire. Slumdog Millionaire. It's out of Bollywood. Bollywood movies are different. They can have 10 different storylines as opposed to Hollywood's maybe have 2 or 3 storylines. And usually there's no kissing in Bollywood films. Now let's go on to a familiar theme in mass media, diversity. And diversity has not been really found to be the case in films because you have a lot of whiteness in films, to put it bluntly. The Oscars are very typically given out to white people, and you actually have whitewashing that goes on in films where white people are cast for people of color. We're seeing less of that today, but films still have a long way to go in terms of diversity. What about censorship? Well, just like books, films also have gone through censorship. And in 1909, theater owners formed the National Board of Censorship to establish a standard for movies. And they wanted to prohibit prostitution in films. They wanted to prohibit childbirth in films. They wanted to prohibit masturbation and drug use. And all of which today are very common in films. And so that didn't work. But the motion picture industry then found a new film called Motion Pictures Producers and Distributors in America, MPAA, and they controlled the content of movies until 1968. And that went away, and then finally we get a rating system, the rating system that we have today, produced by this same organization, MPAA, and we have the movie system today that's allowing it's movie theaters attempting to take matters into their own hand and say, okay, we're not going to be censored, but we're going to tell the audiences what the viewing ages are of these films. So you have G for general audiences, you've got PG for parental guidance, you've got PG-13 for parental guidance, strongly caution, some material inappropriate for 13-year-olds. You've got R for under 17s accompanied by adult. Of course, those are the films that everybody wanted to get into when they were a teenager. You've got NC-17, no one under the age of 17 is admitted. Again, people were going to go. And then you have the pornography films, which is XXX, which is not trademarked by the MPAA, but the pornography industry thought that it would be funny to create a designation for their own films, and so they created the XXX. All right, so what is the future of movies as we head on to the future? It's tough to say. We do know that we will see more viewing inside the household as TVs get bigger and have more clarity in their screens. We're going to see probably more pay-per-view, people being able to buy films, especially in a pandemic, in their homes per film. We're going to continue to see premium film channels like Showtime and HBO. We're going to continue to see product placement, which I haven't mentioned in this class. I will when I get to advertising. That's where advertisers pay to have a product inside of the film. And we're going to continue to see the interaction of movies and the internet, where you can watch films on the internet through YouTube and through Netflix and through Hulu and all the other means of streaming. And so movies are headed into a new era, the likes of which is yet really to be determined, but we know it's going to have a lot to do with the internet. And that wraps up our class on movies today. Have a great day.